Welcome to Reformed Thinking. I am your host, and I am so glad you could join us today for this deep dive into our source material.
Yes, thanks for having me. I am really looking forward to getting into this one.
Me too. So today we are looking at Charles Spurgeon's The Treasury of David, and we are going to focus specifically on Psalm 143.
Right. It is a really fascinating text.
It really is. And our mission for you today, as you listen, is to extract some practical theological insights on how to handle overwhelming despair.
Yeah, and we're also going to look at how to silence the accusations of slander.
And we will unpack the intense tension between asking for divine justice and pleading for pure mercy.
Because those two things usually do not go together easily.
No, they do not.
No.
Normally when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of, well, total clarity. You break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points and says, there it is. That is the problem.
Right. It is binary. You look at the film and the bone is either broken or it is not broken. It is clean, visible, and easily categorized. Human beings find a lot of comfort in that kind of visual confirmation. We like things to be tangible.
We really do. But then you step into the world of spiritual despair, or you step into theological tension, and suddenly that physical x-ray machine is just useless.
Utterly useless.
We're looking at a diagnostic landscape of the human soul that is murky, confusing, and filled with contradictions. We are trying to chart the anatomy of depression and faith, and those things do not show up on a scan.
No, they do not.
So to set the stage for you, historically, ecclesiastical rabbis categorize Psalm 143 as one of the 7 penitential psalms.
Yes, that is the traditional academic bucket for it.
Right. The assumption was that this is a text about a person weeping over their own personal failures.
Yeah.
But Spurgeon views it very differently.
He really does.
He reads it as a martial vindication against slanderers, rather than just a weeping confession of fault.
Yeah, he calls it a mingled strain. He describes it as a box of ointment composed of sweet, bitter, pungent, and precious ingredients all mixed together.
That is quite an image.
It is. It is the outcry of an overwhelmed spirit struggling to rise above the mud and grasp the best things. The image Spurgeon paints is striking.
Tell us about that image.
Well, the petitioner's hands are outstretched to heaven in a posture of complete surrender, but at his girdle hangs a sharp sword rattling in its scabbard.
Oh, wow. So he is armed.
Yes, he is a warrior who has been beaten down, not a monk who has been sitting in quiet contemplation.
And that warrior imagery brings us to a really fascinating paradox right at the beginning of the text. I want to bring in an analogy about legal systems to make sense of these opening verses.
I think that is a great way to frame it.
So think about walking into a modern courthouse. In the first verse, the author asks God to answer him in his righteousness.
Right.
He's essentially asking for a hearing in what historical English law would call a court of requests. This was a place where you would present a petition for a civil dispute.
A place to settle grievances between people.
Yeah. You go in saying, someone has wronged me, and I want the judge to look at the facts and vindicate my name.
That is a brilliant way to explain it. He wants a civil ruling against his human enemies. He wants the record set straight because he knows he is innocent of the specific slander being spoken against him.
But then in the very next breath, in verse 2, the author begs God not to enter into judgment.
He completely changes his tune.
He does. It is like he suddenly realizes he is not walking into a small claims court. He's desperately trying to avoid the court of King's Bench.
Which is a terrifying place to be.
Yes. In historical terms, the King's Bench was the highest criminal court, where the crown itself was the prosecutor, and your actual life was on the line.
So the stakes are infinitely higher.
Precisely. How can the author simultaneously plead for God to answer in strict righteousness, but then turn around and beg God not to enter into judgment? It sounds like a total contradiction.
That is the core tension of the courtroom paradox. And the answer lies in the doctrine of universal condemnation.
Unpack that for us.
When the author says, "In thy sight shall no man living be justified," he is stating a blunt legal reality. This is long before the Apostle Paul ever picked up a pen to write the same truth in the New Testament.
So the author already knew the legal standing of humanity.
Yes. The mechanism here is critical to understand. The author realizes that he cannot isolate a single incident for God to judge. If you invite the omniscient judge to evaluate your character, you do not get to limit the scope of the discovery phase.
Ah, I see. You cannot just hand the judge the one file where you look good and hide the rest of the boxes.
Spot on. You cannot hide anything. God's sight is so piercing, so discriminating, that the absolute slightest flaw in the human heart is seen and judged.
So pretense is useless.
Completely. Pretense cannot avail where that glance reads all the secrets of the soul. There is a synthesis here that resolves the paradox.
How does that work?
Well, the godly man, in his desire to have his character vindicated against his human enemies, appeals to the just judge. But he instantly falls back with a guilty sense that before that ultimate divine tribunal, he has no inherent merit to stand on.
He knows he would lose the bigger case.
Yes. John Owen, the historical commentator, points out that the author does not pray absolutely that God would forego his government of the world.
Okay.
He simply prays that God would not judge him based on his own duties and obedience, because those fall desperately short of perfection.
That distinction changes everything about how we view justice. It is a terrifying thought to demand pure justice for yourself when you realize what that actually entails.
It really is.
John B. Goh shares a fascinating anecdote that perfectly illustrates the psychological weight of this reality. He was speaking with a young man who confidently claimed, "I do not think I am a sinner."
That is quite a bold claim.
Very bold. This young man felt he was basically a good person who had never done anything terribly wrong. Now, Goff did not argue theology with him.
What did he do?
He simply asked the young man if he would be willing for his mother or his sister to know every single thing he had ever done, said, or thought.
Oh, wow.
They asked him to imagine his every motion, his every fleeting jealous thought, his every petty grievance broadcast for his family to see.
And you can imagine the immediate horror of that proposition.
Exactly. After a moment of hesitation, the young man admitted, "No, indeed, I should not like to have them know. No, not for the world."
Which is how most of us would react.
Yeah. Goff then pressed the logical point. He said, if you cannot bear the scrutiny of your own family, who love you and are flawed themselves, how can you dare to say in the presence of a holy God who knows every microscopic thought of your heart that you do not commit sin?
That is a devastating argument.
It really puts it in perspective. If your own mother seeing your thoughts would ruin you, what happens when the creator of the universe reviews the ledger?
That story highlights the sheer terror of the Court of King's Bench. If we are judged by the law, we are finished.
So how does anyone survive it?
Well, to understand how the author resolves this terrifying tension, we have to look at the concept of substitution. Consider the anecdote of the dying Christian woman.
Tell me about her.
A revered minister visited her in her humble home. She was at the very end of her life, facing eternity, and the minister asked her the ground of her hope. How could she be at peace?
And what did she say?
She replied with complete composure, "I rely on the justice of God."
Which, based on everything we just discussed, sounds like a completely suicidal thing to say. Asking for justice is asking for condemnation.
It surprised the minister, too. But then she added the crucial twist. She said, "Justice, not to me, but to my substitute in whom I trust."
Oh, that is brilliant.
She understood the exact legal mechanism of forgiveness. Forgiveness is not inconsistent with truth or righteousness. God does not just sweep sin under the rug and pretend it did not happen.
Because that would make him an unjust judge.
Yes. The pardon God bestows in mercy is bestowed in justice to the substitute who discharged the sinner's obligations. The debt was fully paid, so justice demands the prisoner be set free.
It is an incredible legal transaction. You get the mercy, but the mercy is backed by ironclad justice.
Absolutely.
Thomas Lai adds another layer to this when he looks at the specific phrasing, "with thy servant," in verse 2.
Yes, that is a key phrase.
The author does not say, "Enter not into judgment with an enemy, a rebel, or a traitor." He says, "thy servant."
Even the faithful servant is in danger.
Yeah, even the person wholly devoted to God, consecrated to his ways, must lose their case if judged by the law. Matthew Henry captures this beautifully by saying that we ask God not to enter into judgment with his servant because his servant has already entered into judgment with himself.
That is a great way to put it.
The servant has already looked at the ledger and pleaded guilty.
William Gurnall uses a chilling geographical analogy for this exact situation.
Let's hear it.
He says that whoever attempts to enter life by a law-based righteousness is trying to find the northern passage to the Indies.
Meaning it is impossible.
Right. Whoever attempts it is sure to be frozen up before he gets halfway there. It is a suicide mission.
Mm-hmm.
God has nailed that door shut. There is no passage through the ice of the law. You will freeze to death trying to prove your own goodness.
So, having established the absolute impossibility of standing on his own merit, we naturally have to look at why this author is so desperate for an audience with God in the first place.
He is taking a massive risk.
He is. Why risk approaching the bench at all? The answer is that the external pressures are absolutely crushing him. Slander has broken him down.
The situation is dire.
We see the enemy has persecuted his soul, smitten his light to the ground, and forced him to dwell in darkness like those long dead. But here is where I want to push back a bit against the Stoic ideal we often associate with religious figures.
Okay, what do you mean?
Well, we tend to think that a truly spiritual person should be immune to this kind of psychological collapse. If this person is so full of faith, why is his spirit overwhelmed and his heart desolate?
It seems like a contradiction to some people.
Yeah. Shouldn't genuine faith act as a shield against that level of despair? You would think a spiritual giant would just brush off the insults and keep moving.
You would think so if you adhere to a purely Stoic philosophy, but the psychological reality of slander and persecution is vastly different.
How so?
The author is no Stoic. The text shows us a man of intense thought and feeling, smarting under cruel assaults on his character. We have to understand the mechanics of slander.
It is not just name-calling.
Not at all. Slander is not just someone saying something unpleasant. Slander is the systematic dismantling of your social reality. It isolates you. It turns your friends into skeptics.
It changes how the whole world sees you.
Yes, and it has a physical weight to it. The text describes it as a blow that overthrows the mind as though it were literally knocked down with a fist.
It creates a cognitive dissonance where you start wondering if you were losing your mind.
Yes, and that is reflected in the original language. When the text says his heart is desolate, the Hebrew word used there translates more accurately to stupefied or full of amazement.
Stupefied. That is a strong word.
It implies the mind is agitated, beaten back upon itself in complete perplexity. He is unable to comprehend the mystery of his own suffering.
He is just spinning in circles.
He is driven to haunt caverns and holes, feeling like an unquiet ghost. It is a state of total mental paralysis.
Sir Richard Baker outlines what he calls the three miseries found in this text to explain the totality of this collapse.
This is a great breakdown.
I want to look at these miseries one by one because they chart the exact downward spiral of a ruined reputation. The first misery Baker identifies is the greatest persecution.
And why is it the greatest?
Because the enemy targets the soul itself, not just goods or the body.
This is a crucial distinction. If someone steals your property, you lose your wealth. If someone attacks your body, you lose your health.
But the soul is different.
Very different. If someone slanders your character, they are attacking the very essence of who you are. They are trying to rewrite your identity in the eyes of the community.
It is a total erasure of the person.
Yes. If the enemy can win the soul, or destroy the reputation that houses the soul in society, he does not care about the rest. The attack strikes directly at the spiritual life and the person's ability to function in the world.
That leads directly to the second misery Baker identifies, which is the greatest overthrow. The author is struck downward to the ground.
The physical posture of defeat.
Yeah, this is the physical posture of severe depression. The enemy strikes him downward to prevent him from looking up to heaven.
Which cuts off his hope.
Right. When you are hit with that level of psychological pain, you cannot look up. You are pinned down, staring at the dirt. Your vision is entirely restricted to the immediate reality of your own suffering.
And that restricted vision locks him into the third misery, which is the greatest captivity.
Dwelling in darkness.
Yes. Baker describes this as dwelling in the darkness of dead men. He is not just in the dark for a single night. He is kept in such severe obscurity that he feels entirely forgotten.
Like he's already buried.
Exactly like that. He feels as if society has already buried him, and he must be looked for among the tombs. His soul has grown cold and stiff in this suffering.
So the despair makes sense.
It does. So to answer your earlier question, this intense despair is not a lack of faith. It is a testament, well, it is proof of the brutal, effective reality of the attack.
Matthew Henry has a great quote about this very dynamic. He says that the author was not only a great saint, but a great soldier. And yet even he was sometimes ready to faint in the day of adversity.
Even the strongest fall.
Yeah. As Henry puts it, how fir trees if the cedars be shaken? The cedars are the massive, deeply rooted trees. If a storm is violent enough to shake a giant cedar, the smaller fir trees should be terrified.
That is a brilliant way to illustrate the point.
Even the strongest among us can be brought to a point where the spirit completely faints. And that brings us to the specific mechanics of recovering from this emotional and spiritual paralysis.
How do you get back up?
Right. How do you restart a stopped heart? We see the method in the next sequence of the text. The author moves from despair to deliberate action.
He changes his focus.
He does. He says, I remember the days of old. I meditate on all thy works. I muse on the work of thy hands. I stretch forth my hands unto thee. My soul thirsteth after thee, as a thirsty land.
This transition is fascinating.
It is, but it raises an immediate question for me. Isn't living in the past often a symptom of depression? When someone is constantly looking backward, we usually tell them they are stuck.
That is true in modern psychology.
So how is remembering the days of old presented here as a cure rather than a trap?
That is a very sharp observation. It is a cure because of the specific method applied. Nostalgia is a trap.
Nostalgia is just wishing things were different.
Right. Nostalgia is wishing you were back in a romanticized version of the past because the present is too hard. But what the author is doing here is an active gathering of facts.
He is building a case.
Yes, an arranging of evidence and a deliberate communing with God based on historical precedent. The commentators present what we might call the three graces of a depressed mind recovering its footing.
What are those three graces?
Memory, meditation, and musing. Each one builds on the other mechanically.
Let's break down that mechanism. How does memory function here?
First, memory acts as the gatherer of raw materials. When you are staring at the dirt, as we discussed in the second misery, your immediate data set is entirely negative.
All you see is the pain.
Right. So the author uses memory to pull data from outside his current situation. He remembers past deliverances. He recalls that God rescued his people centuries ago.
The big historical moments.
Yes, he remembers the parting of the sea, the provision in the wilderness. He is collecting objective historical facts that prove God's character has a track record of rescue.
So memory brings the bricks to the construction site. What does meditation do?
Meditation takes those raw materials and arranges them into a structure. If a quick glance at the current situation is discouraging, he ruminates on the long histories of divine providence.
He starts piecing it all together.
Meditation is the act of taking a wide view of how God's works operate together for good over centuries. It is not emptying the mind, which is how modern culture often defines meditation.
It is the exact opposite of emptying the mind.
It is. It is actively filling the mind with specific, arranged truths. You are building a logical case against your own despair.
And then comes musing. What is the difference between meditating and musing?
Musing is the act of discoursing on these truths. It is turning that internal meditation into an active spoken dialogue with God. It is taking the structure you just built and living inside it.
Putting it into practice.
One commentator likens it to playing a harp to chase away the gloomy spirit. A.W. Mummery expands on this by encouraging us to look for God earnestly in all of creation as part of this musing process.
Looking at nature?
Yes. We look at the vineyards, the dense foliage of the forest, the weird pageantry of clouds, the pensive fading beauty of autumn. We gaze at the physical world until we see a creator of absolute wisdom, sovereignty, and love.
Looking away from our own failures.
Right. When the work of our own hands grieves us, we shift our focus to the work of his hands.
William Gurnall describes this active meditation as prayer's handmaid.
Yeah.
I love this agricultural analogy. He says meditation is the plow that prepares the hard-packed dirt of the heart for the seed of prayer.
It breaks up the tough soil.
And once the seed is sown, meditation acts as the harrow that covers the seed with dew so the birds do not steal it.
That is a wonderful picture.
Without this active engagement, the memory would just be a passive trap of nostalgia. But by actively musing on the evidence of God's character, the author restarts his spiritual pulse and kindles a burning desire. He creates a massive thirst for God.
That burning desire is so vividly captured in the metaphor of the thirsty land. The author says, "My soul thirsteth after thee as a thirsty land."
It is a very raw plea.
It is not just a poetic flourish. It describes a very specific physical mechanism.
Sir John Chardin made a brilliant observation about the dry lands in the East that perfectly visualizes this mechanism.
What did he see?
He noted that before the rains fall, the ground bakes under the intense sun. The heat pulls every drop of moisture out of the dirt,
Leaving it totally parched.
Yeah. The ground begins to crack from the intense dryness, creating deep fissures and chinks that are so profound, well, so deep you cannot even see the bottom of them. The earth literally yawns. It opens its mouth in dumb pleadings for water.
What a powerful visual.
That is what the author means. His soul feels parched, cracking under the drought of his circumstances, and his outstretched hands are exactly like those deep crevices waiting for the rain.
And when rain finally hits that cracked earth, it does not sit on the surface. It vanishes instantly into the deep fissures. The ground absorbs it completely.
It drinks it all in.
Henry Drummond adds a fascinating philosophical layer to this natural thirst. He argues that it is entirely natural for a human soul to long for God in this way.
Like an instinct.
Yes, just as a swallow naturally seeks its nest, or a hummingbird instinctively seeks its palm trees. Drummond says that true poetry is science in another form.
What does he mean by that?
He means that the spiritual realm operates with natural laws, just like the physical realm. The true, intended human environment is God himself. Just as the water brooks are designed to meet physical needs, God is the sole element that meets the spiritual needs of man.
So there was nothing artificial about this longing.
Absolutely nothing. There is no false note in this aspiration. It is not morbid, and it is not forced by religious guilt.
It is just biology of the soul.
It is the most natural thing in the world for a soul separated from its intended environment to thirst for it desperately.
But this intense natural thirst leads directly into the agony of waiting. When the ground is cracked and the crops are actively dying, it needs water right now.
Waiting is not really an option.
No, if the rain waits another month, it does not matter. The crops are dead. And that sets up the extreme urgency we see in the next part of the text, where the suppliant cries out, "Hear me speedily, O Lord, my spirit faileth."
He is out of time.
He asks to hear loving kindness in the morning, and to know the way he should walk. This brings up another point of tension for me.
Let's hear it.
Does demanding God to answer speedily cross the line into sinful impatience? It feels incredibly bold to put the creator of the universe on a ticking clock and say, "You need to answer me by morning."
It does feel bold, and it feels demanding. But John Fawcett provides some excellent insights that clarify this tension and remove the stigma of impatience.
How does he explain it?
He explains that desiring swift relief is a fundamentally natural human condition. It is how we are wired. Whatever a person desires to have, they naturally desire to have soon.
We hate waiting.
We do. Any delay in the accomplishment of our wishes causes grief because, as the old proverb says, hope deferred makes the heart sick. Fawcett argues that there is absolutely nothing sinful in this desire for speed, provided it does not devolve into murmuring, bitterness, or distrust of God's ultimate plan.
So the speed of the request is just a measurement of the pain.
That is right. If a person does not desire the light of God's countenance quickly, it is a certain proof that they do not truly desire it at all.
Because true pain screams for an immediate fix.
Yes. If you are indifferent to when the rescue comes, you do not really feel the danger. The author is simply stating a physiological and spiritual fact. His life is ebbing out. His spirit is failing.
The tank is empty.
If help is long delayed, it will arrive too late to save him from this specific despair. Mercy has wings to its heels when misery is in extremity.
Thomas Calvert points out that when affliction strikes, a person in misery earnestly sues for speedy delivery. We never think help comes soon enough.
We always want it yesterday.
Calvert uses a very humorous contrast to highlight this natural human desire for speed. He looks at the baffling response of the Egyptian Pharaoh during the plagues in the book of Exodus.
Oh, this is a great story.
When Moses asked Pharaoh when he wanted the plague of frogs removed, Pharaoh inexplicably answered, "Tomorrow."
Which makes absolutely no logical sense. Your house is filled with frogs, your bed is filled with frogs, the ovens are filled with frogs, and you say, "Tomorrow works for me."
Right. Calvert points out how unnatural that is. What prisoner does not want his iron knots loosed immediately? What mariner caught in a hurricane wishes for a long storm?
No one in their right mind.
We want affliction to have hinds feet to run away from us. We want pain to sprint out the door. The only area where human beings naturally procrastinate is in leaving our own favored sins. There, we are quite happy to say tomorrow.
That is a very telling human flaw.
But when it comes to pain, the cry for speedy relief is universal. It reaches even to Christ himself in the garden, praying for the cup of suffering to pass from him.
And once the author asks for this speedy relief, he makes a very specific mechanical request. Cause me to know the way wherein I should walk.
He wants directions.
He does not just want the pain to stop, he wants a navigation system. George Beryl Cheever shares a gripping story that perfectly captures the feeling of needing God to reveal the path.
I would love to hear it.
Cheever describes a time when he was lost in a gorge near the Gemmi Mountain in the Swiss Alps.
Describe that landscape, because it is vital to understanding the panic.
Imagine standing at the bottom of a massive bowl of solid rock. Cheever was surrounded by completely inaccessible regal crags, sheer granite walls rising thousands of feet into the air.
So he is completely boxed in.
Yes. He looked in the direction he thought he needed to go, and he saw only seemingly impassable snowy pyramids and sheer icy precipices. Every avenue looked like certain death.
It's terrifying.
He sat down, his self-resource entirely exhausted. He realized he was physically trapped, feeling like a man in a cage made of mountains. But then, when all human confidence was gone, he decided to blindly follow his local guide.
And what happened?
Suddenly, as they walked toward a solid wall of rock, a hidden door opened in the mountain face. It was a narrow, concealed path cut into the stone that was invisible from a distance. That hidden path allowed him to rise up out of the gorge and walk at liberty on the high ground.
That is a stunning picture of what the author is praying for. He is hemmed in by the providence of God. He is staring at precipices of slander and caverns of despair.
He is in that same rocky cage.
He has no map, and his self-resource is gone. He needs the great first cause to open that hidden door in the rock face. And this moves us to the next logical action the author takes.
What is his next move?
Finding that door in the mountain wall mirrors what happens next in the text. The focus shifts beautifully from seeking immediate rescue to seeking long-term instruction. He says, I flee unto thee to hide me. Teach me to do thy will. Lead me into the land of uprightness.
I want to bring in James Smith's breakdown of what it means to flee to God in this context.
What does Smith say?
Smith says fleeing implies several things. It implies danger, it implies fear, and it implies a total inability to defend oneself. But most importantly, it implies prudence and foresight.
Foresight, how so?
The believer sees the storm gathering on the horizon and looks out for the covert before the rain starts falling. Fleeing is a highly calculated move of self-preservation.
So Richard Baker uses the analogy of a school for this specific section of the text. He says this passage describes the perfect classroom, which contains the three best components you could ever ask for.
What are the three components?
First, it has the best teacher, which is God himself. Second, it has the best scholar, which is a thoroughly humbled student who knows he has zero answers. And third, it has the best lesson, which is to do God's will.
That is a great summary of the text.
But my question here is about the nature of that lesson. Why is there a specific focus on doing the will rather than just knowing it? We spend a lot of time trying to figure out what God's will is. Why does the author jump straight to the execution of it?
That is a critical distinction in Reformed theology. The mechanics of obedience require two separate parts. Vincent Alsop answers this by pointing out that we must pray for God to teach us to know and then teach us to do.
So they are two distinct steps.
They are not the same thing. Knowledge without obedience is lame. It cannot walk. Obedience without knowledge is blind. It walks right off a cliff.
The dangerous combination either way.
If we offer God only one or the other, we are offering the blind and the lame, which the Old Testament law explicitly rejects as unacceptable sacrifices. We need both the sight to see the path and the strength to walk it.
Thomas Manton adds to this by saying that the Spirit's direction always has strength joined with it. The Spirit does not just point a finger at the right path and say, good luck.
The Spirit goes with you.
The Spirit actively inclines the human will to choose the good and provides the internal power to walk in it.
Thomas Shepard uses a wonderful nautical analogy to explain this relationship between the Spirit and the law in the life of a believer.
Let's hear the analogy.
Imagine a large sailing ship sitting in the water. The law of God is your compass. It provides the objective, unmoving rule that steers your course. It tells you exactly where true north is.
Okay, so the compass gives the direction.
Right. But you can hold a perfect compass in your hand all day long, and the ship will not move an inch. A compass cannot propel a ship.
It has no force.
The Holy Spirit is the wind that fills the sails. The Spirit provides the velocity and the drive for our obedience. The Spirit and the law, the wind and the compass, stand perfectly well together. You need both to cross the ocean.
When the author prays, teach me to do thy will, he is sitting in a dead calm, asking for both the compass of God's revealed will and the wind of the good Spirit to propel him forward. He wants to be led into what the text calls the land of uprightness.
The Hebrew word used there is mishor. Geographically, it refers to the smooth upland downs of Moab. It is a very specific type of terrain.
Contrast that with the Gemmy Mountain Gorge we talked about earlier.
Yes. The gorge is dark, rugged, full of sharp rocks, confusing turns, and constant danger. Mishore symbolizes an even, level plane.
A flat, safe landscape.
It is a state of equity and righteousness that is entirely free from the rough, crooked turns and the malice of enemies that exhaust the weary traveler. You do not have to watch every single step for fear of twisting your ankle or falling off a cliff.
That sounds like an incredible relief.
He wants the wind to blow him out of the dark caverns of despair and up onto those bright, level pasture lands where his soul can walk without constantly stumbling.
But to reach that smooth upland plain, the traveler needs absolute revitalization. His spirit has already failed. He has no energy left to make the climb.
He needs a boost.
And that prompts the final, urgent pleas of the text. He prays, "Quicken me, O Lord, for thy name's sake," and then he utters a controversial prayer asking God to cut off his enemies, ending with the declaration, "For I am thy servant."
Let's look closely at that.
Let's zero in on the phrase, "for thy name's sake." If the author has just boldly declared, "I am thy servant," why doesn't he plead his own track record of service? Why rely entirely on God's name to get this quickening, this new spiritual life?
It circles right back to the courtroom paradox we discussed at the very beginning of our conversation.
The king's bench.
Yes. The believer knows that despite being a servant, he has absolutely nothing inherent to plead before the ultimate judgment seat. The ledger is hopelessly unbalanced. All requests for spiritual life, for this quickening, must rest entirely on God's character, his glory, and his faithfulness.
Explain what quickening actually is, mechanically speaking.
Quickening means to give life to something that is dead. It is like applying a spiritual defibrillator to a stopped heart. You cannot ask a dead body to generate its own heartbeat.
The body cannot fix itself.
The energy has to come from an outside source. As Andrew Robert Fawcett notes, the plea for thy name's sake means asking God to act for the sake of his own glory. You are asking him to show himself to be the God of loving kindness and power that he is esteemed to be.
I see.
If a doctor brings a flatlining patient back to life, it proves the skill of the doctor. If God creates a high degree of spiritual life in his broken, despairing servants, it renders his name glorious in the eyes of all who watch it happen.
That makes total sense.
The author knows he cannot say, "Quicken me because I have been such a good, reliable servant." He must say, "Quicken me because you are the living, loving God, and it aligns with your righteous character to rescue those who trust in you."
And that reliance on God's righteous character brings us to the uncomfortable nature of the final verses, where he prays for the complete destruction of his enemies. He says, "Of thy mercy, cut off mine enemies."
This is a tough verse for many people.
In a modern context, that sounds incredibly harsh, vindictive, and counter to the idea of grace. How do we contextualize a prayer that asks for destruction out of a motive of mercy? It sounds like a total oxymoron.
It does sound jarring to modern ears. We are used to thinking of mercy only as pardon, but we have to read this text through the lens of its historical and theological context.
Which means looking at the Old Testament setting.
As Spurgeon points out, under the Old Testament arrangements, this was a warrior's prayer. It smells of the dust and smoke of a literal battlefield. Archibald Simpson provides a crucial perspective here, explaining the mechanics of divine justice in history.
What is his perspective?
He says the destruction of the wicked is often a direct, necessary mercy to the innocent.
Give me an example of how that works.
Think about the historical forces of oppression. Look at Pharaoh driving his chariots toward the Israelites trapped at the Red Sea, or look at the Assyrian king Sennacherib surrounding the city of Jerusalem, starving the inhabitants and preparing to slaughter them.
They were facing mass casualties.
In those moments, the destruction of those tyrannical, violent powers was the exact mechanism of God's mercy and kindness to the people they were trying to annihilate. If you do not stop the oppressor, you are showing zero mercy to the victim.
Oh, that makes it very clear. You cannot have both.
James Bennett adds that many of these imprecations are actually prophecies of events concerning future leaders of oppressive nations, not expressions of personal, petty revenge over a minor insult.
It is about justice on a macro level.
The author is praying for the vindication of right over wrong on a cosmic scale.
He is asking for the moral arc of the universe to bend toward justice, and for the agents of chaos to be removed so the innocent can live in peace. And he grounds this entire plea in the final phrase of the text, "I am thy servant."
That is a defining statement.
This is his ultimate identity. Andrew Gray breaks down what it means to be a servant in the ancient world, noting there are 4 distinct ways to enter into servitude: by birth, by purchase, by conquest, and by voluntary agreement.
4 distinct legal categories.
The intense reality for the believer is that they fit all 4 categories simultaneously. This creates an ironclad bond between the servant and the master.
Let's look at how all four apply. First, they are servants by birth. They are born anew into the household of faith.
Second, they are servants by purchase. They were bought out of the slave market of sin by the payment made by their substitute.
Third, they are servants by conquest. Their natural rebellion and stubborn will were subdued and overcome by the wind of the Spirit.
And fourth, they are servants by voluntary agreement. Having been born, purchased, and conquered, they willingly and joyfully choose to sign the contract and submit to the master's will. They want to be there.
Thomas Watson notes that the Roman Emperor Theodosius thought it a greater dignity to be God's servant than to be an emperor.
That is quite a statement from an emperor.
This absolute belonging, backed by birth, purchase, conquest, and choice, is the final bedrock of the author's confidence. The despair is gone. The anxiety over the slander is gone. He is secure.
And that security is what allows him to finally rest. He knows the judge is his substitute, his guide is the Spirit, and his identity is eternally fixed as a servant in the house of the king.
It is a complete theological rescue.
That realization of absolute belonging completely shifts the perspective on everything we have discussed today. If you are listening to this and you recognize that you belong to this reality by birth, by purchase, by conquest, and by your own choice, your entire framework changes.
It reorients your whole life.
And since the demand for ultimate justice is fully satisfied by your substitute, you are completely freed from the terror of the courtroom. The gavel has already fallen, and the verdict is in your favor.
The king's bench is no longer a threat.
So, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. If all of this is true, what happens to your perspective when you stop viewing your daily hardships, your periods of intense desolation, and your detractors as just enemies to be destroyed?
That is a challenging question.
What if you start viewing them as the very tools designed to create that deep, cracked earth thirst within you? A thirst that makes you stretch out your hands and seek the smooth upland plains of God's presence.
It changes pain into a catalyst.
When you go back to that broken x-ray machine we talked about at the start, you realize that the murkiness of your spiritual diagnostic landscape is not a flaw in the system. The muddy waters of despair and the rattling sword of slander are the very things that drive you out of self-reliance and force you to look for that hidden door in the mountain wall.
That is a wonderful way to sum it all up.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into our source material. We will catch you next time on Reformed Thinking.